I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dr. Bernard Beitman, the founding director of the Coincidence Project, which encourages people to tell each other their coincidence stories. He's a former chair of psychiatry at the University of Missouri-Columbia and has a private practice in Charlottesville, Virginia. His education includes Swarthmore College, Yale Medical School, and psychiatric residency at Stanford. Bernie's manual Learning Psychotherapy received 2 national awards for its unique interactive training program for psychiatric residents. He's internationally known for research in panic disorder and chest pain, and has edited several books on how to integrate pharmacotherapy and psychotherapy. So, Bernie, welcome. We are talking today about synchronicity and coincidence and meaningful coincidences. That is the title of your latest book, Meaningful Coincidences, How and Why Synchronicity and Serendipity Happen. So you published this last year, and again, I'm going to put links into the show notes and the YouTube description and all of that so that people can learn more. Can you give me kind of a brief introduction to what the book is about and why people need to read this?
The title is the first hint. It has both synchronicity and serendipity in it, and a lot of people do not put the two together. But since I've been doing this for quite a while, some people use synchronicity to mean serendipity, and some people use serendipity where others would use synchronicity. So trying to define those words has been a key part of this. And if you're interested, and I hope you are listening to this and watching us, you have meaningful coincidences in your life, and you may call them one or the other, synchronicity or serendipity, but they happen and they're meaningful to you. And if you want to have some good idea about how to understand them, how to categorize them, how to use them, this is the book for you.
Yeah, well, so let me get into that. In the foreword to this book, Dr. Terry Marks Barlow wrote that you've examined coincidence through multiple lenses. So there are a few different ways that you're looking at this, including Carl Jung's synchronicity, Horace Walpole's serendipity, Paul Kammerer's seriality, and then your own concept of simulpathity. So can you tell me a little bit about these different approaches to similar phenomena?
Jung coined the term synchronicity to mean meaningful coincidences. And in its use these days, it's mostly about interpersonal change, development, mostly about psychological development, and certainly about spiritual development. Jung had a strong mystical component to the way he think and the way he felt. So that's not to be surprised, because this is the guy that came up with the word synchronicity. And his followers tend to use it the same way. And serendipity was a term, as you mentioned, came up with Horace Walpole, who was in the British government in the 1800s. And what he did was find things by accident that he needed. He called it Walpoliania. That he could do that. He needed a little something, and there it was. And he just stumbled across it. And that's become serendipity, named after the 3 princes of Serendip, an old fable about 3 princes who found stuff by accident and used it. And so serendipity now means happy accidents. And it takes a prepared mind to be able to see these accidents.
Okay. So yeah, that's a couple of them. And then there was also, seriality, I guess, and we can come back to that later. And then you have your own concept, and we can explore that more in depth. But, one of the things that I did want to mention was in the book, you described presenting at the Serendipity Society, and you've also talked about a surprisingly large number of academics who are interested in coincidence. So as you mentioned, I think this is something that happens to all of us throughout our lives, right? And, when it happens, sometimes it's obviously coincidence, and sometimes there's just that feeling. It's like this means something, So would you say that there are a lot of people involved in studying this, maybe off and on, and were you able to take a lot from work that's been done there?
The Serendipity Society had its first formal meeting in 2019. It hadn't been around for a while. But they gathered academics primarily who are studying serendipity, and they study it in ways that are pretty much what academics do, and following scientific ways of thinking about things and writing for standard journals so they can get promoted. So they tend to be working within the scientific framework, which I think is really very important. One study involved doing MRIs on people who experienced a lot of serendipity, and to see how the brain differed between those who did and those who didn't. And that's the kind of idea that I like to suggest may need to happen. And the serendipity guys tend to be doing that. And that's mostly in Europe, although there's serendipity people in the United States. On the other hand, the synchronicity one, it tends to be, oh, wow, look at my story. People saying, oh, look at that. Please read my story, Dr. Beitman. I've got so much to it. And I try to refer them to the Coincidence Cafe, where we meet on every third Saturday of the month on Zoom at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And if you're interested in telling other people your coincidence stories and hearing other people's, because you may be isolated like a lot of other people, I can't tell other people my stories. They tend to be more in the synchronicity area. They may, that feeling that you mentioned, Tim, it happens a lot. And some people have a lot of them, and I call them high frequency coinciders. And we invite people like that to come to the Coincidence Cafe so they can not feel so isolated and have other people be able to listen to them.
Okay. Well, you know what? After the show, I will get a link to that, and I will put that in the YouTube notes as well. So you've also done actual studies on this yourself. And I recall reading about coincidence forums that you distributed, and you collected and analyzed. And I believe you have done some work putting together kind of a database of this as well, right? Can you tell me about some of your past studies or experiments in it and the results that they produced?
I'm just a dumb scientist, Tim. I'm not going to go way out there first. I think there's a lot of way out to get to, but my first question was, okay, I've experienced a lot of coincidence. I hear people have, but just can I get some data to back that up? And there were just a few studies which involved questionnaires which weren't very well organized and defined. So I did a valid and reliable study scale called the Weird Coincidence Survey that would have been approved by statisticians and psychologists, because they did approve it as a valid, meaning it was true and reliable. It could measure the same thing. So we started off with 1,000 people answering the Weird Coincidence Survey, just to say, well, how often do you have these things? Because we could make a list of 10 after a while. And we got answers. So that the most common one, I just ran into somebody in the woods the other day, and she says, oh, yeah, I think of somebody and they call me. That happens all the time. I'm used to that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, and this is kind of off my questions list, right? But I think one of the things, when you're looking at mathematical correlations, and I know that that's something that's very important, in your own work, that falls within the realm of known science, right? But a lot of folks tend to look at this as maybe being some kind of a psychic or ESP phenomenon, or a connection to Jung's collective unconscious, something along those lines. Do you think that there might be some kind of extrasensory perception involved with some of these or all of these? Or do you think that science, as we understand it, can explain them all?
No. First of all, no on that one, Tim. Science can't explain it all, and so they don't pay attention to it. They don't even have a way of thinking about some of these things. And let's take the simple one of telepathy. Because you mentioned the parapsychological thing. Some people think that. Well, I do too. I think this telephone thing where you think of somebody and they call you, in all its variations, and there are really some funny variations on them, has something to do with being able to know somebody else is thinking about you, that we call telepathy, that we can pick up information from other people's minds. And I've got a model for how to explain that using the concept of the psychosphere, our mental atmosphere. So in addition, just for the data and people who want numbers, not just me having a model of it, there's an excellent article in the American Psychologist a couple of years ago that reviewed all the data on many different parapsychological phenomena. And the data got published in a standard psychological journal. That was a breakthrough. The guy did a wonderful job in putting that all together. And I sent you that link, and you could put it on the website for other people to see.
Yeah. Well, and I will absolutely put those links up. Now, you basically categorized this phenomena into three main types of events. And then in the book, you describe what makes them happen and try to explain in detail what could potentially be going on. Could you describe those for me? How do you tend to break these down and categorize them?
Well, it's science does work by breaking stuff down. And that's what your question is. And that's a problem sometimes. You got to you get down to the details and you miss the big thing. So
Yeah.
but it's still it's an iterative process, and people want to do one or the other. I want to go out and know what everything is in the universe, and other guys want to just take things apart all the time. This is a world of polarity in which there's a dynamism between these extremes of getting spaced out and then trying to test it out. And I wanted to take these terms, synchronicity, serendipity, seriality, and simulpathity, and say what is the basic elements, what are the building blocks, kind of like looking at the atoms of a molecule. What's the building blocks that make these things meaningful coincidences? And it's one of those funny things once you start seeing it the way I just saw it. Oh, you get, okay, yeah, yeah, I understand that. Well, it took me a long time to get there because there's a lot of stuff to go through. And the two basic elements of any meaningful coincidence, and please, somebody tell me I'm wrong, because I'd like to hear that I'm wrong about this. The two basic elements are a mental event and an objective event, something that anybody else could see. So mind and object are the two basic elements of every meaningful coincidence. And when you make generous statements like that, somebody's got to find something wrong, but I haven't. And so mind and object. So there are three types then you can get out of the two. Any two you can make into three. So there's mind and object, which is probably the most commonly reported. You think of somebody, for example, and they call you, or you think you need something like money, and it shows up, or you need a job and somehow it appears. This doesn't happen all the time. None of this happens all the time, but it does happen. So mental event matches something anyone else could see. You got the job offer. Anybody
Yeah.
could see that letter, but they can't see that you're thinking about it unless you tell them about it. So mind and object is a very common one. Other one is telepathy, mind. One mind picks up what's going on in the other mind. And the term simulpathity I had to invent because it's the experience of the pain of a loved one at a distance. And I got that first experience when my father was bleeding into his throat, choking and dying 3,000 miles away from me, where I was choking uncontrollably around the same time. And the more I tell that story, that I was picking up what my father was experiencing, the more I hear people tell me that that happens to them sometimes too.
And if I could jump in quickly, my mother told me, and she's still around, she still tells the story occasionally. She had many years ago an intense pain in her hand. And for some reason, she had the idea that her mother might be involved. So she called her mother on the phone, and they picked up, and her mother, my grandmother, had just burned her hand very badly while she was cooking, right? And again, in terms of coincidence, this happened at the same time, right? The pain and and the actual burn, and these were hundreds, potentially thousands of miles away. They lived in different states at the time, and so from a coincidence perspective, yeah, it's uncanny, right? And I think that is what kind of gives it meaning is, we have like minor coincidences happen all the time. All of us do, and that's to be expected. But some of these are uncanny is the only word to describe it.
Or weird, or meaningful, or far out and groovy, or whatever kinds of adjectives you like, but they're meaningful and you remember them. You remember them because they are uncanny, because they're unexpected, because they're strange, and modern science can't explain them. But when you get thousands of people, probably more than thousands, because the data is only little blips that I can get, experiencing some things like this, you got to say, ladies and gentlemen, there's something going on here that may be repeatable, that is repeating. It's single cases, but they add up. And one case might be just an aberration, but in multiple cases, then you got a pattern going on. And there's the pattern of simulpathity, and you just described it, and they're just all there. And so part of what I'm doing, and I appreciate being able to talk with you, Tim, is trying to let people know that we've got capacities that we're told we don't have. But
Yeah.
we do. We do.
Yeah. There's something more, right? And that's I think the feeling that most of us have. There's something more, and I think that as human beings, we're struggling to define that. Now, in the case of synchronicity, and I'm trying to connect this a little bit back to more mainstream science, Carl Jung worked with Wolfgang Pauli and consulted with Albert Einstein, which led to the Pauli-Jung conjecture, which brought elements of quantum mechanics into the phenomena. Do you view this as an explanation, or maybe a partial explanation, or is this kind of too mechanistic, I guess?
Well, by this, you're using quantum mechanics, and there's a few different little things in quantum mechanics that we have to pay attention to. Now, the favorite one for explanation is entanglement. And the entanglement idea is that you take a photon or an electron and you pair it with another one. And that's not a simple process to get them working together. And then now this happy couple gets separated, and you do something to this one, reverse its spin, for example, and this one's spin reverses in the opposite direction. And it happens simultaneously. Einstein called that spooky action at a distance. He didn't believe it. And there may be reason not to believe it. But my father and your mother with the hand and the choking have a very nice analogical connection with the spooky action at a distance.
Yeah.
It looks like the two electrons, and the two people often in a simulpathity experience and other ones are closely bonded. And so these paired electrons, and me and my father, your mother and her mother, are closely bonded. So the analog, the analogy looks really strong. The only problem is these little things ain't the same as us big things. And there's a big gap between the two. And people are getting boron molecules to get entangled, but that's not the same as me and my father, or your mother and her mother. There's a gap there, but people fill it in because it's such a lovely analog. And that's that non-local entanglement is a very popular, and let me say it's the theory du jour, because wow, it's physics. Oh, it's quantum physics. That's really cool. That must do it. So people use hard to understand theories to explain hard to understand phenomena. And I can do telepathy in a much simpler way than that analog, but it's a favorite one. But if you don't mind, I'd like to continue on this quantum thing.
Sure.
Because it's really very important ideas in there. One of them is called collapsing the wave function. That means if you observe a molecule, a photon, or an electron, if you observe it, it then goes from a wave to a particle. So there are particle and wave dualities of those. You observe it and it goes down. And the famous slit experiment, you can look up Dr. Quantum and show you a wonderful cartoon about that on YouTube, and show you how that thing works. You measure it, actually you observe it. What that means is measuring it or observing it, it collapses the wave function. And what is a wave function? And that's the trouble when you don't know what the word function means there. You're thinking it like the wave has certain functions. It does something. But that's not what collapsing the wave function is. Collapsing the wave function, the function is an algebraic equation. Function is another word for an algebraic equation. And once you observe this equation becomes something different. And what actually becomes something different, this key point, they don't know. They don't know what is actually happening. They have an observation, a mathematical observation that says something's happening. But what's happening for this wave becoming a particle? How does a wave become a particle? They don't know. They don't have a picture, a model of how that works. So that's a limiting thing. And some people use, well, the wave functioning got collapsed because, what? Okay. And put it in some other ways. But finally, the point I think so very important is that these particles and waves make up an electron or a photon. So an electron and a photon is both a particle and a wave. So it contains its opposite. Each contains its opposite. It's like the yin yang thing. It's like the polarity of our world. That's a key message of electrons and photons, is they contain their opposite. And when they contain their opposite, they're usually part of something greater. And some theories think that there's some background thing that connects these particles that are at a distance from each other that may better explain how this duality is part of something much greater.
Yeah, yeah. There is a lot there. And I agree with you on the science. In fact, I just saw a book about basically misrepresentations of quantum mechanics that I need to do an interview on. So it is the theory du jour, right? People grab that and they say, okay, this is complicated. Most people don't understand it. So psychic powers. I'm like, okay, these two are not necessarily the same thing, although it is interesting because they both do have this spooky action at a distance. Now, in addition to physics, Carl Jung was influenced by psychics. He was influenced by the work of J.B. Rhine, who founded parapsychology as a branch of psychology and did a lot of testing with Zener cards and other statistical and analytic tools. So do you think that these help to offer insights, again, in a general way into what might be going on?
If you need data, he gave us data early on. And they tightened the protocols all the time, trying to make sure that distance didn't make have any problem, or other variables didn't have any influence. And they were able to show you could look at one card, and the other guy over there would pick up that card with some higher than 25% degree probability. So it suggested something was going on. But one of my favorite reviews of an article about parapsychological things was the reviewer said the statistics are done very well, as they were at the Rhine Institute. The conclusions follow from the data. The summary of the conclusions is very good, but I don't believe it, so I reject the paper.
Okay. Well, I want to touch on Paul Kammerer's work a little bit as well. And this is something that you talk about in the book. He tried to describe constellations or clusters of events as peaks of moving probabilities. And again, from reading through what you'd written, as well as a little bit of background research, the impression that I get is that he was very much looking at it from a rigorous mathematics perspective. So he was moving away from, the psychic hand waving type stuff. And he was saying, okay, how can we explain this in more conventional terms, I guess? Do you think that, I know that that's the direction, and I'll come to this in a few moments, that's the direction some of your work has gone. Do you think that he offered a really good grounding for this, or do you think he might have been missing something a little bit larger?
Well, I don't think he would, to start with, he wrote his book, The Law of Seriality, in German. He's an Austrian botanist or biologist, in 1919. So it was before Jung's synchronicity thing came out. And Jung was influenced by Kammerer because Jung was trying to explain synchronicity, and Kammerer had an idea about it. The important thing to know about Kammerer to start with, although there's much more to him than he wrote in his book, that he did observations of events in the world. He was an object kind of guy. He wasn't trying to match a mental event with an external event. So he wasn't trying to be psychic. He was trying to see that things seemed to cluster together, that people have the same color umbrella. Okay, maybe they went to there's a popular store, but names would come together and numbers would come together. And in his book, he's able to talk about pairs and sometimes more, where one guy would show up in 3 different places. And that's the seriality thing. He talked about 2 prisoners, both with the same name and 6 other characteristics that were like each other, and their parents mixed them up, at least looking at the data about them. So he was interested in object kinds of things, and he wanted to use the science of the times to be able to say how they worked. And the clustering, as I could understand it, had to do with once things are together, a bunch of the same things are together, and then they separate and float around in the psychosphere, my term, they are drawn together. It's like attracts like. The same things come back because they had started together. And that kind of separation of information and then coming together was a basic part, from what I understood, of what Kammerer was trying to be able to describe. And there was something more to it. And Jung was able to say, I think I can use something a little bit more than what Kammerer did.
Well, and on that note, I want to jump actually to your book again. There's a cover of your book on the wall behind you in the poster. And yeah, and on the cover of that, you'd mentioned earlier that your book was the first hint, there is actually another hint as well, and that is a repeating fractal pattern that is on the cover of the book. And that was something, again, in the foreword that was mentioned. So if I understand correctly, part of your work is looking at these series of coincidental events and saying maybe these fit into a fractal pattern of repeating coincidences, right? And I think this comes back exactly to what you were just saying about Kammerer's work, although it sounds like you've definitely extended that and taken it in a little bit different direction. Could you describe that a little bit for me?
Well, first, let me show more clearly what this fractal is on the cover of the book. It's a golden spiral. A golden spiral. It's based on the Fibonacci numbers, and it has a certain symmetry and aesthetics to it that make people build things following this Fibonacci formula. And the small things build on the big things, but the patterns are all the same, even though they vary in scale. And this fractal idea is worth trying to be able to tell our audience, because it's not an easy concept. You can see it there. And that my original version of that cover was to have a nautilus shell on the bottom, a nautilus shell, like a snail shell, again with the same spiral, because nautilus shells can get bigger, but the spiral stays the same in proportion to it. And then the other thing was supposed to be a spiral galaxy up here. So it's supposed to be a spiral galaxy and a snail shell. Well, the book companies want to put them together, and I'm glad they did, in the term, and made it a golden spiral, which summarizes the basic idea. So it's repetition patterns, but even that gets a little abstract. So let's do a simple version of fractals. Go outside and watch a tree. It ain't doing much, but it is doing a lot. It just looked like it's standing there, but it branches. It starts with a trunk, and then it branches in different ways. And just amazing how a branch comes off the trunk. If you look at it, well, why'd the tree pick that place? But it does. And then the branch branches. What else do you see that branches? Well, simple versions are rivers at a delta. They start off with a main river, and then they start branching and create a delta. Then look at the way your nerve cells branch. They start off with a big one, and then they start branching very much like a tree. And blood vessels the same thing, a major blood vessel, it starts branching. So this branching is a common phenomenon in different parts of our reality, but it's the same basic pattern. And that's what I'm doing with coincidences, is seeing the same basic patterns in a variety of different scales and situations.
Yeah, and one of the things that you talked about are, again, so two or more patterns repeating together in time. And Sigmund Freud made it clear that humans could repeat patterns as well in their behaviors and things like that. Fractals are generated by seed patterns. And so, in a way, when I read this, I thought this almost reminds me of the butterfly effect, right? Where something small happens, and again, this could be the seed pattern. Something small happens and something larger happens, and multiple larger events could happen, this cluster or constellation of events. And in some ways, they all contain this seed, much like the Nautilus shell contains the Fibonacci sequence, right? And so maybe they come back together later because they're all related by whatever started them. Is that?
Well, yeah, I think how they come back together again is still the fun part of this. But let's talk about the butterfly effect. The butterfly effect was the idea that you could see a butterfly flapping in Tibet, and that would create a reaction somewhere in Phoenix, Arizona. That was a simple idea, but the real butterfly effect was that a person studying the weather was playing with how to understand how weather changes, because these weather guys have trouble being able to predict past a few days. I mean, they can get further out and they're getting better. But back when he was doing it, they could only go a few days because one little change would change the whole thing. And that was the butterfly effect he was looking for. And the funny thing is, the first diagrams he starting with a little change, ended up looking like butterflies. And that was more what the butterfly effect was for me, or in addition to it. But what you're talking about also are chaos and complexity. And these are not easy concepts to grasp, but I'll try to suggest simple ways of thinking about them. Chaos and complexity are related in that chaos, you put one little thing in and you get a wide variety of possibilities. Complexity, you have a bunch of different inputs, and so those different inputs make a more complicated outcome. But the fundamental of both of them, and this is something that is so important, I think, in living our lives, is that between the chaos of like all kinds of weird things happening and the structure of nothing happening or too much structure, in that between chaos and structure is creativity. In there is the flow. In there is a place we want to get to. It's definitely true on the dance floor, not to get too wild and not to get too stiff, but the place in between. And the funny thing is, once you get to that place in between, it becomes effortless, and you become able to, in the dance floor, be able to move. And when people talk about being in the flow, that's part of recognizing that you're in this middle of thing where it doesn't take much effort anymore, except to not get too complex, not too chaotic, and not too structured.
Wonderful. On that note, let me thank you so much for your time today. And again, the book is Meaningful Coincidences. I'm going to put copious links into this so that people can follow up and learn more about this and hopefully learn how it applies in their own lives. Let me close by asking where this field of study is going, because it seems like, as you've mentioned, there's research into possible psychic effects. There's research into mathematical correlations. There are, rigorous data collection going on. There's a lot going on, and it's very diverse, I guess. Where do you see this going in the near future?
And I would add in business and in organizations, that's getting to be a bigger place for serendipity and synchronicity to be happening. Where it's going, I have the kind of why questions, and if I can get away from administering the coincidence project, I have a couple of ideas in mind, but it's also to gather people who are working in different aspects of meaningful coincidences, which, as I mentioned, is in organizations as well as in groups, as well as in individuals. I've formed the Coincidence Project. And we're going to have a research arm if we get any money to do that, because you got to have money to pay people to do these things. I want to take a bunch of coincidence stories like ones we've just had, your mother and my father, and try to be able to look for patterns using artificial intelligence. Take a bunch of stories, stick them in, have viewers, raters find the patterns and see what AI does with them. So that's one idea. I want to develop a model for the psychosphere. The psychosphere is our mental atmosphere. And our mental atmosphere is like the biosphere and the geosphere with stones and stuff. Um, it exists in the atmosphere between the ionosphere, I think, and the Earth's crust. And there's a lot going on in there that our minds and our brains can tune into, which can possibly explain the feeling of being part of something greater without having to go out to some far out galaxy and just think of it as just being right here. I want to be able to gather people who are doing research in meaningful coincidences and create a journal in which they can put their ideas together and be able to dialogue with each other. So those are some ideas.
Wonderful. Thank you again for your time, sir, today.
You're very welcome, Tim. Thanks for great questions.